When the shroud of Nazi occupation fell over Europe, the spies followed with it. Beginning with the blitzkrieg seizure of Poland and continuing all the way to France in the west and swaths of the Soviet Union in the east, German intelligence infiltrated to any place on earth that commanded Adolf Hitler's appetite. When Hitler finally licked his lips and looked toward the British Home Isles, it was certain that his interest meant that his spies were already there, walking among the populace, blending in and conspiring to bring the whole thing down. But little did the British public know, or the German state for that matter, the British intelligence was more than ready for their adversaries to come knocking. In a years-long cloak-and-dagger chess match, British spies weren't just going to find the Nazis in their midst, they were going to compromise them and use them to spread lies that were bound to reach the Führer himself. Pulling directly from the accounts of Sir John Masterman, who was himself an architect and critical part of the double-cross system, today we're going to pull back the curtain on one of the UK's most ingenious maneuvers, bending the gun of Nazi intelligence backward and forcing the Nazis to fire on themselves. Now, we would hope that anyone watching today's video has at least a cursory understanding of World War II. Except for you, Peter, we just know you're here for the vibes. So rather than go through the play-by-play of how the Nazi war machine swept through Europe, we'll instead look at what was going on in Great Britain during that time. The fall of France on May the 10th, 1940, the evacuation of British and French troops from Dunkirk, and the resignation of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain saw the UK thrown into chaos. Norway had fallen, Spain was firmly committed to neutrality, and America, despite her supply ships and her assurances of friendship, was nowhere to be found. Refugees from all across Europe, and in fact all over the world, were attempting to find some modicum of safety there, and the troops that had been lucky enough to survive the war thus far were trying as best they could to prepare for the coming storm. With that storm were guaranteed to be spies. The British government responded early to the perceived threat in two ways. The passing of the Treachery Act in 1940, which would allow the country to prosecute and execute enemy spies, and by beginning the large-scale internment of foreigners in order to try and sequester anyone who might wish harm upon the crown. But these were passive, stopgap measures. There was no way to take the fight to German agents. At least not yet. As Winston Churchill and his parliament scrambled to figure out Britain's survival, its intelligence chiefs were left to peer across the English Channel, trying and failing to scrutinize just what might be happening beyond. But with the lines of battle drawn, the British had at least one advantage, despite being in such a disadvantageous overall situation. Even if nothing else, the British now had a clear view of their country. They knew everyone who was on the Isles now. They'd kept track of anyone who had arrived recently and anyone else who happened to drift in. They could all be carefully catalogued and scrutinized. There was no doubt that there were Nazis in their midst, that the Abwehr had managed to get some of their best agents through to Britain. But the table was set, and now it was just a matter of finding them. The British Security Service, known colloquially and in this video as MI5, was the organisation in charge of counter-espionage on the Home Isles. MI5 was pragmatic enough to admit that it was operating from a disadvantage, not just because it could conceivably be compromised, but because it had no way of telling whether it was completely infiltrated or, just as feasible, not infiltrated at all. The reality almost certainly lay somewhere in between. So it was that uncertainty that MI5 attempted to deal with first. That is to say, it had to find the spies. But just as important as finding them was figuring out what should be done with them after. For MI5, the answer was clear. If they could be caught, they should be turned from enemies into assets. Even before hostilities broke out in 1939, MI5 had internal discussions on the value of double agents, and they'd been able to cultivate more than one. The most important of the pre-war years, a spy with the codename Snow, who had infiltrated the Abwehr organization, had been able to funnel critical information about the Abwehr and its existing networks across Europe. The story of Snow is long, and it's a really odd one. This was an agent who at many times appeared to be playing the British and the Germans against each other for his own shadowy purposes. But he nonetheless formed the basis for most of the intelligence connections and information MI5 had before Britain was isolated, including several German agents who had already been found out. Other double agents already existed, some of whom were fully trusted and accepted by the Abwehr. Now, as the Germans sent more spies into Britain by parachute, submarine, refugee ship, and false passport, the table was set for MI5 to start fighting back. Now, in the latter part of 1940, MI5 had quite a bit of success identifying intelligence agents as they arrived. The ones that were inserted by parachute, in particular, had to arrive by plane at a time when planes over Britain were tracked extremely diligently, and they often arrived under-equipped, poorly trained, and with very little money and shoddy documentation. Not only that, but a lot of incoming agents' passports and papers were designed using specifications that the agent Snow had fed to the Abwehr, an opportunity MI5 had used to build in telltale signs of a fake. The ones sent in through other means were usually no better equipped. Some appeared quite obviously out of place, and many of them, when push came to shove, were not particularly motivated to do their work against the threat of death. But that didn't mean that they were necessarily easy to turn. Agents who might have been too closely in communication with Germany were unfit to even attempt conversion, and if a spy didn't appear genuinely to want to save his own life by collaborating with the British, then he was unlikely to play along with what MI5 wanted him to relay to Germany. One early failure, known under the code name Summer, arrived to Britain in early September 1940 by parachute, and although he was captured by MI5 almost immediately, he proved to be very difficult to control. After lying to his handlers and attempting suicide, Summer was kept under close guard, but eventually attempted to escape by nearly strangling one of the guards to death. After getting away on a motorcycle, and to quote Sir Masterman here, fortunately the motorcycle, being government property, was not very efficiently maintained, it was eventually rounded up. When he was found, he was carrying a canoe with vague plans to escape by paddling to Holland. Summer's failure to adapt to work as a double agent clued MI5 in on what it meant to run these sorts of operatives for any length of time. Far from acting in fervent support of Hitler, Summer appeared to break under extreme psychological stress, an experience that demonstrated to MI5 just how carefully these men would have to be handled. Other new agents proved to be equally difficult to manage. One of them, codenamed Giraffe, turned out not to have been very interesting to his Nazi handlers and basically sat idle in the time that he was associated with MI5. Another, known as Gander, was given a radio that only went one way, meaning that MI5 could just take his radio and send the Nazis their own messages without needing a double agent at all. A third, known as Jacobs, broke his ankle when he parachuted down. One Abwehr spy, known as Tate, turned out very differently. Tate had been an associate of Summer prior to his arrival in Britain, and Summer clued MI5 into the idea that Tate would be following him, so MI5 made sure to scoop him up. Tate would go on to be crucial to the double-cross program. After agreeing to work with MI5 in October 1940, he would exchange messages with the city of Hamburg all the way until May of 1945, and actually became a favorite agent for Nazi intelligence, who were thrilled when Tate became a war photographer working near the British front lines. With Tate's success juxtaposed against the failures of the rest of the early double agents, MI5 began to build a roadmap toward a higher rate of success. Other new agents made a similarly big impact on the double-cross program and were able to aid British intelligence in ways that MI5's own agents couldn't. One of them, a wealthy Yugoslav man under the codename Tricycle, was able to use his connections to high society in order to meet high-ranking Nazis and travel to neutral countries. At one point, the Nazis even dispatched him to America in order to organize a separate spy network there. Another double agent, codenamed Dragonfly, was able to feed the Germans a constant stream of MI5 approved fake intel for some 2 years. Now, fortunately, we can't spend too much time regaling you with all of the stories of the many odd ducks and eccentric characters among the spies, but suffice to say that each agent caused MI5 both headaches and cause for celebration at varying times. In these early few months, MI5 had a few specific goals that commanded their focus. Not only did they hope to map out the German spy network in the UK, but they wished to use that intelligence to create their own maps of the intelligence network inside Nazi Germany. They were on the hunt for ciphers and codes, which might help them decode other intelligence, and if possible, they wanted to glean any knowledge about the enemy's plans by piecing together the bits and pieces of information that they got from each captured agent. Finally, there was the purpose of the fake intel that they were feeding back to Nazi Germany, not just to convince the Germans not to attack, but to try and get them to attack in the wrong places for the wrong reasons, while getting them to react to British threats that didn't actually exist. As the operation began to pick up steam, the MI5 officers in charge gained more and more control over the German intelligence apparatus. In fact, it's no exaggeration to say that they gained complete control. That didn't mean that the leaders of the double-cross program got complacent, far from it. During the entirety of the operation, MI5 acted under the assumption that it could still be surrounded or even infiltrated by German spies who they just didn't know about. As Sir Masterman put it, that caution led to quite a few missed opportunities, but it ensured that their operation would have survived even with a great deal more opposition than it ever ran into. But before long, MI5 was getting signals that it controlled the whole operation. For example, the agent Tricycle's Nazi handlers had told him about an agent the Nazis described as highly skilled and intensely secret, but when Tricycle revealed the agent to MI5, they recognized him as an agent they had already compromised and who the Nazis hadn't even been very interested in. Over the course of the entire war, the only agent who was known to have spent a significant amount of time undetected was a man named Ter Braak, who was believed to have arrived in November 1940, but was only discovered in April 1941 after having committed suicide in an air raid shelter after his money had run out. Every other spy who is now known to have arrived in Britain was identified, captured, and either turned, imprisoned, or executed. With a growing network of double agents, MI5 had another layer of complexity to consider. How would they control and coordinate what information was fed back to the Nazis, and how could they do it without cluing the Nazis in on the deception? MI5 was also having to cross-coordinate with MI6, foreign intelligence, so in order to manage the operation, the British had created a board consisting of the UK's 3 highest intelligence directors. Obviously, these 3 had a lot more to worry about than a few double agents, so in January 1941, they created the so-called 20 Committee to oversee the operation. This committee brought together many of the best and brightest from across several realms of British intelligence and warfighting, and it's actually where the entire operation got its name, not from the fact that they were double-crossing the Nazis, but because the 20 Committee was denoted using the symbol for 20 in Roman numerals, a double X, or a double cross, if you will. Yes, it was a pun, and no, we unfortunately don't have time to discuss MI5's extensive and very, very real reliance on puns throughout this entire operation. Every week, for the entire war, the 20 Committee would hold a meeting, and at every meeting, they would carefully coordinate which lies were being told to the Nazis by which agents and which information was to be kept carefully guarded. Straddling the authority of MI5 and MI6, the 20 Committee was largely on their own to make decisions about the program, and the committee's work went exceedingly smoothly for most of their time together. Then there were the people responsible for handling the double agents. 3 MI5 officers formed a small directorate over the program, deciding which new captured spies should be turned or discarded and guiding the overall program in day-to-day operations. Underneath them, a handful of case officers directly liaised with each of the double agents, making sure that they were kept paid, housed, fed, guarded, and coached on precisely what they were supposed to be doing. The case officers were responsible for knowing their agents inside and out, reporting back to the directorate on what the agents would do, what they would say, and how they would feel about being asked to relay their lies back to the Nazis. On the back end, technical officers and intelligence managers handled the needs of the double agents and processed any information they were able to collect. And although in most cases bookkeeping would probably be terribly boring, in this scenario it was absolutely crucial. Everyday intelligence had to be checked, double-checked, cross-referenced, vetted, and checked again to make sure that it didn't conflict with anything else that any agent had ever said, and the penalty for missing something could be as high as the entire operation falling apart. They couldn't reveal something these spies wouldn't reasonably know by doing what the Nazis believed they were doing, and they had to mix in real intelligence often enough that these spies were still thought to be useful. The 20 Committee performed this precise dance all through 1941 as the Germans fished for information about the British military, targets for air raids, and any information that might help them threaten an attack from the sea. Often the Nazis were looking for highly technical information on the military's organization, as well as how the troops were being shifted around the islands and whether any of them seemed as if they might be going abroad to fight. Coastal defences, land and sea mines, and new British weapons were also of great interest, as was the quality and preparedness of His Majesty's Navy and Air Force. The 20 Committee's double agents responded in kind, sometimes via the radio, sometimes via coded letter, and sometimes even by foreign travel. As the network grew, the 20 Committee stationed double agents in several European cities, all of whom were being asked different questions by the Nazis and doing their best to keep up. In 1942, the Nazis' curiosity shifted to the sorts of agricultural, economical, and morale information that might be helped to determine how long London could hold out before the country began to collapse. Again, the questions they were asking were deeply educational to the British, who could now see just how their own endurance under bombardment was starting to frustrate Berlin. As British counter-air raids began, the Nazis began searching for more knowledge on the UK's bombers and their expected next moves. MI5 fed the information back that they wanted the Nazis to believe, but they also threw in some tricks of their own. They convinced the Nazis to bomb fortified aerodromes instead of towns full of civilians. They created a false narrative that Britain was planning to invade Norway, and they misled the Axis in advance of Operation Torch, the Allied landings to begin a campaign in North Africa. Now, MI6 wasn't perfect during this time. Many such plans fell through, and a few times agents like Snow suffered breakdowns or left the program. Often its officers believed that the program was being underutilized amidst a much larger war effort. But overall, MI5 had Nazi intelligence bamboozled, so thoroughly in fact, that even when MI5 attempted to create a scenario that would expose themselves for running a double agent very poorly, the Germans seemed to not realize even a blundering double agent could exist at all. So when 1942 crossed into 1943, the 20 Committee's ultimate objective was finally able to evolve. For years, the handlers and agents of the double-cross program had been waiting for the chance to participate in the ultimate deception, the decisive sleight of hand that would finally bring Allied troops back to continental Europe. The moment for that critical blow wouldn't come till 1944, but like all best-laid plans, it took serious time to put together. For the double-cross program, that was what 1943 was ultimately all about: holding out, keeping the network alive, and creating the trap that Churchill and his allies would eventually spring. The first step was to try and keep Axis forces in Western Europe, rather than letting Hitler shift them to the Eastern Front to fight the Soviets. While this might have seemed like a bad idea on face value, in reality it was a long con, intended to force a collapse on the Eastern Front and begin a crush inward from all sides towards Berlin. The double-cross team played their part nicely, creating threats of beachhead landing and counter-invasions and forcing Axis air power into wars of attrition. This situation kept the Germans constantly shifting their forces around Western Europe, but never committing them to the East, where their front lines were rapidly collapsing. During this time, one agent known as Zigzag was dispatched back to Nazi Germany, working on resistance networks in France and unsuccessfully trying to convince his handlers that he should assassinate Hitler. Other agents faked successful sabotage operations and grew their spy rings with highly skilled Yugoslav and Portuguese operatives. The organization grew mightily in strength, despite some difficulty here and there, with all minds focused on the ultimate mission, setting up the invasion of Normandy. And in early 1944, the time finally came. The double-cross teams became threefold: convince the Allies that the Allied attack was more delayed than it was, convince them that it was coming in the eastern area of the suspected landing zone instead of the western area, and once troops had landed, create the specter of a second beachhead landing in order to pull Axis troops away from the defense. Here, the stakes were incredibly high. If the Nazis caught onto the trick, they would be able to see the true invasion plan simply by looking at the areas they were being led away from. Dozens of agents would be involved, and the number of people in the know about the double-cross program had gone through the roof. We can't understate just how possible it was that the program might have collapsed under its own weight before the landings took place. In fact, multiple agents were compromised or captured just before D-Day. But the plan continued on. First, the double-cross team fabricated the idea of British and American armies concentrated in Scotland and East England, forcing the Germans to assume that the landing would come in the Pas-de-Calais area. We know from after the war that the Nazis bought the lie, and they were also led to overestimate the date of the D-Day landings. The Axis believed that the landings would come on June the 9th. They actually came on June the 6th, and again, the double-cross agents were to thank for this. One agent, known as Garbo, submitted a memo directly to German High Command that attempted to urgently convince the Germans that the troop build-up they could see, that is, the real force of the D-Day landings, was only a diversion. To show you how well it worked, we'll just leave it to a transmission the Germans sent to their allies in Madrid to quote, "All reports received in the last week from this agent undertaking have been confirmed without exception and to be described as exceptionally valuable." End quote. And even after the D-Day landings took place, the Germans were convinced that a second assault was coming. When it didn't, the Germans didn't realize they'd been had. They assumed for months that the main attack had been called off because the landings at Normandy were so successful, and they kept troops prepared for that false landing long after the real Allied force had stormed much of Europe. And because the double-cross group was still receiving transmissions from the Axis requesting information, they clearly understood what topics the Axis didn't even know to ask about. Remember, at this point, MI5 controlled Germany's entire intelligence network in Britain, so what Germany knew consisted entirely of the lies MI5 fed to them. Of course, this deception involved a whole lot more people to pull off than just the double-cross program. But it was the double-cross program that formed the linchpin of the entire operation's success. Now, with the Allies storming the beaches of Normandy, it might have appeared that the work of the double-cross agents were done. The Axis was being squeezed in a vice from all sides and had no need for intelligence on Allied locations that they could no longer attack. But the Germans still hadn't realized the agents in their midst, and now the program might have a different use, worming its way into Germany in advance of a final operation to end the war. The first big advances here came from Agent Zigzag, who had returned to the UK after months of lavish treatment by the Germans. He brought back repositories of information on German cruise missiles known as V1s and V2s, and on the state of German cities and the people's morale during the Allied bombing campaigns. Another set of agents, this time in Canada, laid the groundwork for anti-Nazi operations if German intelligence was to flee to America after the war. For their part, the Germans were scrambling to try and figure out where and when Allied bombers would come back, and they were typically quite unconcerned with dealing with anything except that problem. Naturally, the double-cross agents responded by feeding more and more false information, but the real meat of the double-cross team's work was in dealing with those V1 and V2 rockets. These were just about the only way that Germany could continue striking Britain, and the Germans badly wanted to know how good their aim was. This presented a pretty obvious opportunity, and MI5 responded by reassuring the Nazis that they were doing a great job hitting their targets while actually leading the rockets to coordinates that lay away from densely populated areas. By 1945, most rockets were hitting far away from major cities, even as MI5's agents told their Nazi handlers about just how magnificent London's destruction truly was. By now, the Allies were in their endgame. The final major use of the double-cross program was in misleading German U-boats, which, due to technical advancements, were now able to operate for prolonged periods of time without coming to the surface. Since these submarines were basically isolated from Berlin with little hope of getting home, they were especially dangerous and especially ruthless. But the double-cross agent Tate, who had been one of Berlin's favorites since 1940, was now able to convince Berlin of the existence of massive undersea minefields that would have protected thousands of square miles of ocean. The deception kept U-boats entirely out of these areas at the close of the war, and with them gone, the Allies could operate with impunity until they achieved victory. When Berlin fell, the 20 Committee and the double-cross agents were finally able to rest easy in the knowledge that their work was not only complete, but had been instrumental in the fall of the Third Reich. Despite the shrewdness and capability of Nazi intelligence in general, and don't let this video fool you, they were typically very good at what they did. The Allies and their double-cross agents nonetheless outclassed the Axis in this regard. How the war would have gone without them, how much longer or more costly it might have been, we can't possibly know. But history tells only one story, and in the story of how the Allies survived Hitler and took back Europe, the role of the double-cross program simply cannot be ignored.